All right, thank you. All right, let's make sure I figure out the technology here quick. All right, and then Dean, you said the pointer's right here. All right, what's that? Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for having me. What's not in my bio, Kelsey and I know each other, and Dean and I know each other. I started my career at the King DePage Soil and Water Conservation District. I worked with Kelsey there for what 4 or 5 years, and obviously worked with Dean. Haven't seen Dean in 20 years, but great to get back here. So yeah, I started with the Soil and Water District. I moved into the private sector as a consultant. Done a lot of watershed planning around here and throughout the country. But my focus has always been on stormwater. You'll hear this afternoon a lot about the quality side of things. I've dealt primarily, not primarily, both in the quality and quantity side. Kelsey asked me to speak on the quantity, so that's what we're going to talk about first. I know we're going to hear a little bit more about watershed plans, I think, this afternoon as well. So I'm going to try to back into some of this discussion into the watershed. We're going to be talking kind of, at both scales, the site level scale, as well as the watershed scale, as well as some of the groundwater recharge, aspects of what we're looking at too. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. This presentation is intended to be very high level, but get into the weeds for those that are interested in the weeds. So anytime you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. I'd rather ask it as we go as opposed at the end. Um, so basically, the goal of what can we do as, I come out to DeKalb County quite a bit. I'm based out of Oak Brook, but I haven't been out here in a while. Obviously, going down 88, I'll have a lot of development pressure. And so as we look at those sites, as we review, I'm on my village plan commission. I'm always the one that chimes in about stormwater, even though they tell me, "Oh no, that's engineering. Don't worry." I'm like, "Yeah, but I'm on the plan commission. I'm going to comment on it." And so, I really think that's the early stage when we're doing site plan development of where do we have room for the BMPs? Can we put the stormwater features? So I really want to talk about some of that site stuff because, as Peggy mentioned in my bio, I do a lot of work with the private sector developers as well too. And really, when they're even trying to figure out where to put a building or a data center or a store, I always make sure we're talking about the stormwater features early on so that they're not an afterthought. They need to be part, just like a parking lot, just like the building itself. They need to be part of that site plan. So really, we'll get into some of the weeds here today, but so basically, the goal is what can we do to control and minimize is key is the flooding risk. And, flooding is a huge concern. We'll get into the different levels of flooding, but, urban areas obviously are especially vulnerable because we have population density, impervious surface, and aging infrastructure. Do a lot of work on projects. I spent a year working in Akron, Ohio with aging infrastructure. I was the green infrastructure lead. We'll get into the green infrastructure, but we're working with, 90-year-old system trying to implement, remedies to keep combined sewers from going out into the river. But we were trying to use green infrastructure as a tool tying into aging infrastructure. So, urban areas are really, there's a lot of pressure in those areas. But the purpose overall today is, how does land use influence flooding and stormwater, and discuss some of those things I've already talked about: land use planning, design storms, and green infrastructure to help deal with flood mitigation. Gave me two tools to work with here. Yeah. Okay, so starting with some of the key concepts. Stormwater. What is stormwater? It's rain or snowmelt that runs off the surface, and often carrying with it pollutants and overwhelming draining systems. So again, later today we'll talk a little bit more about the water quality side of things. But what types of flooding do we have? We have fluvial, which is just the rainfall itself, high intensity storms, which we'll talk about, fluvial with the river, or compound flooding, where we have two or more flood drivers. We have heavy rain on top of the snowpack, heavy rain at increased river levels. They all occur together, leading to greater impacts. I think back in the day when Kelsey and I were at Soil and Water District, there was one January that the ground was completely frozen, but no snow, and we got a crazy rain, and there was all kinds of issues. We had temporary road crossings that got blown out. It was, just that like worst case scenario. But those are the things we need to try to plan for. That crossing that blew out, the one in particular I'm thinking of, was designed to pass a certain storm event and overtop during another storm event. but it still blew out. And even though it had good design parameters, it didn't account for the fact that we were going to get a heavy, high intensity rain on top of frozen ground condition. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through this just to understand the flooding risk. Basically, we have an urban area here. We get rainfall, we have some infiltration where it can, and then what can't infiltrate, we get runoff. Oh, there's too many clicks in here. So then if we start implementing, stormwater management, we, have that runoff. We try to manage it in storage. Many of you in the Chicagoland area, we're used to detention basins. They're becoming pretty ubiquitous. I've done some work in Missouri, for example, in a very urban town down there. One of the things that caught me off guard coming from the Chicago area was this whole college campus had developed with not a single detention basin. And it just caught me off guard. And when I was flying home, started looking out the window and I was flying into Midway, and, over the suburbs. I'm like, it's because my career has been in an area that's used to detention. And so, I think for us here, there is, a lot of advantage that we do have some, detention, but it still doesn't solve everything. We have storage capacity issues. We get in the urban areas, we get into pipe capacity issues. So when you get those, maxed out, the pipe capacity, stormwater, some of the events we'll talk about in a little bit, plus you have all the other watershed changes, then you end up with urban and riverine flooding. And so really that's what we're trying to look at, is how these land use changes can incorporate the storage, pipe capacity, other infrastructure, so we can reduce the urban and riverine flooding. And the urban, if you think of that, and we'll get into some of the weeds here, but that's really, the risk associated with basement backups, things like that, can cause that very localized flooding. And we did a big project evaluating green infrastructure in Chicago, for example, with MWRD. And that's what it wasn't river flooding we were looking at. We were looking at neighborhood flooding. How can we use green infrastructure to deal with flooding in these localized communities to prevent basement backup? So again, scale-wise, you end up working a lot of variety of scales. And you have that cross-section here, out here too. You have the very old areas, the very urban areas, and then we have the newer areas. So different tools in the toolbox for each of those areas, but we still have the tools available. So just understanding the flood risk, I'm going to go through some kind of cheesy analogies here for you just to drive this home, but high intensity extreme events, this is a very quick rainfall in a short amount of time. The ground can't absorb it fast enough. Just think of it as, pouring a bucket of water on the ground. You pour it real quick, it's going to run right off, right? And, we had flooding in my neighborhood. I won't get into details on that, but we had flooding in my neighborhood. And it was a very high intensity storm that caused it. When my neighbors called me and said, oh, there's flooding, I'm like, no, not in my neighborhood, because I kind of pay attention to this stuff. But it was a high intensity storm, and it just caused more water than it usually had. So, that's just like you get an inch of rain in 10 minutes, and then you have street flooding, and usually you have some of the localized, but this is the flash flooding we hear about and other things. So we're seeing some more of that. Large volume events, this is turn on your hose and let it run for a long time at a slow pace. Again, I had this in my house. We had a hose bib that froze, and I left the hose on for 3 hours. Well, I went in the basement, and if it would have burst, yes, I would have noticed it quicker, but I didn't. It was slowly leaking in my basement. My cat came up with wet feet, and we had 2 inches of water in our basement. So that's when I think of, large volume, low intensity. But the ground gets soaked and it can't, accept any more water. And the flood, then we start getting pipes at capacity, ponds are already full. Then the other event is back-to-back storms. And really this is when, we've had one storm on top of another storm. So the basins, stormwater basins can't recover, the capacity of the storm sewers can't recover. And the analogy here is thinking of a sponge. First storm gets the sponge wet. The second storm makes it saturated. And then the third storm, all the water just pours out because it can't accept anymore. So, those are the considerations that we kind of need to think about when we're thinking about how do we mitigate flood risk. How does land use affect flooding? Obviously, I showed that previous diagram. where we're replacing, natural landscapes with roads, buildings, and then we increase that runoff, but we reduce infiltration. We have, our natural features like wetlands and forests and floodplains that absorb that runoff. Think of the sponge again in a different way, that can absorb that rainfall. And then if we have development in floodplains, those are flood prone areas. So not only are we taking up the sponge, we're putting structures in areas that can flood just by the sheer location of them. And then we have these compounding risk of land use change that amplify. So we have the heavy rains, like we were just talking about, maybe bad locations of facilities, increase river levels, so we end up with flooding there. I also added this as a land use, under the land use. This is a solar panel diagram from Minnesota. And reason, in talking to Kelsey and prepping this presentation, I've done some work wearing my erosion control hat on some solar fields. And what we're seeing in the solar industry is somewhat interesting in the sense that people originally were not viewing it as a land use change. It is very much a land use change from a stormwater perspective. And part of it is because we're looking at, oh, it's got vegetation underneath it, but what the raindrop sees is very different from what it has seen under pre-existing conditions. So why I got pulled into some sites from an erosion perspective is because the engineer had treated stormwater as if the site was going to actually function better than when it was a cornfield, or not from a stormwater perspective. And we're getting a lot of water quality or water coming off the stormwater panels, and it was causing erosion. Personally, my opinion was kind of ignored what the farmer had figured out over the last 100 years. So they were ripping up drain tile. They had, ripped up grass waterways. Again, that goes to my soil and water district days. I was like, no, the grass waterway is here because they couldn't farm it, and they put a waterway there. And so, what this is from Minnesota, some other states like Virginia and others are getting more progressive. And just thinking about what, from a stormwater management perspective and the land use change that is a result of solar panels. This one represents, those of you who are familiar, and I don't know if the ones outside are automated or articulating with the sun. But this actually, not to bring you all back to high school math, but it's actually like a cosine function of the angle throughout the day, where you actually account for the rainfall based on those angle movements. And so it's pretty simplified, but sophisticated way to account for stormwater. And the only reason I bring that up is just driving home that point of solar panels are a land use change from a stormwater perspective. Whether they put goats underneath these to graze, or whether they put pollinators underneath them, that's great. That's all great. But my opinion is we need to account for solar panels as being a land use change when we manage stormwater. That's my soapbox. Sorry on that one. All right, so how can we use land use planning for flood risk mitigation? So obviously, ordinances are a strong tool for restricting development of floodplains, enforcing elevation or flood resistant construction, protecting and restoring wetlands through preservation and riparian buffers. It's funny, just going back up to the zoning, I did a presentation down in Little Rock, Arkansas, probably 10 years ago now. And I was presenting on ordinances, coming from the land of ordinances. And I presented how you could implement green infrastructure through ordinance revisions. And I, basically got done with presentation. There's some people from rural Little Rock area. And they basically just flat out told me that no way are they ever going to do ordinances. And so there, though, then we actually did a little bit of switching gears, and we tied it to their drinking water supply, because down in Arkansas, it's all reservoir driven drinking water supply. So our strategy wasn't to go through the ordinances as the tool to implement green infrastructure. We actually tried to hit home with, this is to protect your drinking water supply. So that goes into kind of the integrated planning, non-structural strategies of the public awareness. We ran media campaigns at the beginning of movies and said, hey, this affects your drinking water. We did this in Northwest Arkansas as well. And so there are opportunities that don't have to be as heavy-handed as ordinances, but I think at the same time, ordinances are a great tool up here in general. We're used to, a lot of the ordinances to drive it, but I think it's a multi-pronged approach through education. This workshop is great. It's education of getting the understanding there. So that's my main point on this is just a lot of tools in the toolbox, but I think it needs to be a combination of those. Yes, sir.
What if the ordinances were established before climate change in these events that we're having now?
Yeah.
And so they're not requiring enough water retention.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about that from an adaptive approach. I think just to hit on that point is, we don't necessarily want to be static in the way we adopt the ordinances, and they need to be a little bit more dynamic. But I will definitely have some slides on that as well. Yeah, Kelsey.
I was going to mention too, the ordinance we look at stormwater ordinances are the two things Mark mentioned was time or duration, and then intensity, which is volume. So as soon as your ordinance requires the development to calculate its new impervious and determine the volume, and then the intensity is stuck in your ordinance. And as climate changes and we see 10 inches of rain in 2 hours instead of 24 hours, do we have to change the ordinance every time?
Right.
To keep up? So those are the questions.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'd say Minnesota has a good example. My colleagues in Virginia, I haven't tracked Virginia as much, but they have referenced that Virginia is actually moving forward quite fast in solar panel, and more progressive from a stormwater management perspective. Yeah, and I think, and again, my statements on solar panels were very much driven from the stormwater perspective, and it largely pulls at my heart. I'm an erosion control person. Again, that's my roots at Soil Water District. It just drove me nuts. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's what I saw on one site, for example. I won't get into the weeds on curve numbers and stuff like that, but for the people that do stormwater modeling, it showed basically less runoff under the built-out condition than the farmed condition. Which anybody in the room here that does do those calculations, it was off. And that one number applied for the whole site. And it was just, and so right away when we saw that, we're like, okay, there's no accounting for increased runoff as a result of this. So, yeah. All right. Any other questions? Oops. Uh-oh. Let's see if I can go back. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about design storms. We obviously hear these a lot in the news and weather reports, 10-year, 100-year. Basically, this is what we were just talking about, having that rainfall event and that quantity or that rainfall amount that we're designing for. So this is, you're one slide too early with your question. Yeah. So we're based on historical data. It may not reflect future condition. There is that need to continually update, the rainfall projections and compound flooding scenarios into design criteria. And then we'll talk a little bit about probabilistic scenario-based planning using that range of possible events, not just single design storms, to build that resilience. So again, I came up with an analogy. I don't know if it's completely applicable, but for those of you that don't know, Kelsey's got a meteorological background, and my analogy is like the weather forecast isn't what happened on December 5th every day for the last 150 years. It's based on models and projections, right? And data. You use that data to inform the future. So I'm a very data-driven person. I can get out of any climate change discussion right now by just talking about the data. Let's use the data as we keep getting more data to inform the future. And again, it doesn't have to get political. It doesn't have to get into climate change discussion or anything like that. I'm just a data-driven person. So that's how I see, some of this scenario-based or probabilistic is, and we'll talk a little bit about how these design changes occur. But, basically, a lot of it is based right now on historic probability frequency of reoccurrence. Why not use that data to look forward? That's progressive. it is, but it goes to your point. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit too. So again, this afternoon, we're going to talk more about water quality, but we did want to talk about water quality from the perspective of what can we do from a stormwater management perspective. And when we look at green infrastructure and other design features, but really we're talking about the smaller storm events or the first portion of the storm. Then there's this phenomenon called the first flush phenomenon. If you think about physical practices or physical pollutants like sediment or other things, it's really what's on the pavement that gets flushed off right away. I worked on a candy manufacturing facility a couple years ago where we all winter the rooftop units had been blowing from air had been blowing out sugar from the facility. They had filters and stuff, but enough got out. And when one of my employees, she did a stormwater sample, she called me, she's like, Mark, the water smells really sweet. I'm like, okay, well, we got to sample it for BOD. And sure enough, it was pretty high in biological oxygen demand. But that really helps the first flush. It sat there all winter. In the next storm event, it rained again. We took a sample and it didn't smell sweet because all got washed off in that first flush. So really what we're doing is trying to incorporate in our design, how do we treat that portion of the runoff that's most likely to carry the pollutants from impervious surfaces and have stormwater features sized to capture those events to treat the most polluted runoff. So again, I think Melissa will talk about it this afternoon, but that's how we get to help affecting the health of our local waterways and increasing the design capacity of the other infrastructure. How can we, for example, talk about bioretention? How can we capture some of that sediment in a bioretention cell that's sitting right there that we could actually go clean out with an excavator or a mini excavator, as opposed to letting it get into a storm sewer structure, having to get vac trucks, having to vac it out, and then go dispose of that properly. So that's one of the things we use green infrastructure a lot for pre-treatment perspective. Underground detention basin, things like that are harder to treat. We'll try to do a pre-treatment that is easier to clean. So I've talked a lot about green infrastructure. What is green infrastructure in BOP design? So it's nature-based solutions that use vegetation, soils, natural processes to manage stormwater and reduce flood risk. So, the effectiveness, again, it's mostly effective on smaller storms and less so for extreme or compound events. The scenario I talked about in Akron, Ohio, we were trying to use green infrastructure to peel off the front of the storm because we were in the billions of dollars of cost, or about 650 million to $1 billion was the overall estimate for all gray infrastructure improvements to the site. So we were trying to use green infrastructure of how do we reduce that cost, that infrastructure cost, but then also beautify the communities, things like that. And so that's really what we were trying to do, two different things. We were trying to get most storms not have to have huge concrete structures, and then improve the aesthetics of the community. So you have multiple green infrastructure that you can combine with gray infrastructure, which is what we're doing in Akron. And basically, case studies show that runoff reductions 30 to 60% for moderate storms when you do have multiple practices combined. So they are effective. They are also very effective from a water quality perspective. I'm not going to go off on a tangent, but for 20 years, my firm has helped EPA manage the national BMP database for where we actually evaluate the pollutant removal effectiveness of green infrastructure and BMPs. You may hear green infrastructure referred to as low impact development as well. There's some nuances there, but just if you've heard of LID, similar concept to green infrastructure. And the effectiveness does vary on the scale and the context. And I'd say the continued research is needed, especially for those large scale storm events. How can you treat and pass through a lot of water in a hurry and deal with those extreme events. So what are some of the co-benefits? Improving water quality, like we talked about, urban cooling, biodiversity, recreation, carbon sequestration, I would say aesthetics. I think, some of the stuff on green infrastructure from a site design consideration perspective is you need to consider the soils, the climate and the space, inundation period, things like that, screening from, the correct location for them, stormwater management solutions, and then modeling versus empirical equations. There's a lot of different ways. I've worked on several manuals where, we've come up with ways to try to ease the way to size and design green infrastructure, because we don't want it to have to always be a complicated calculation. So we did one for the University of Missouri, for example, where we did all the calculations and put them in the manual. And then the designer can actually grab off of charts. I have this much drainage area, I have this much, runoff, things like that. Then they can size it. So we really tried to make it easy based on pre-done modeling, so that then they can size it and implement it according to the current design criteria. But to your point, as things change, those need to be updated, because those were based on specific rainfall amounts, things like that as well. But so some of the examples that you may or may not be familiar with: green roofs, rain gardens, which I talked about, or otherwise known as bioretention, permeable pavers, bioswales, constructed wetland, urban forest, and riparian buffers. Okay, so this is a project we worked on in St. Louis. Basically, this is old church area where this was grant funded, but we did a design to work in a very urban area to improve stormwater and flooding in a very localized area. This was just one step where we did a bioretention cell. We took an old, dilapidated portion of the parking lot that was no longer needed, and used that to put in green infrastructure. So again, we can fit them to the site and get green infrastructure where it wasn't. Not too far from here, we did another project probably 12, 13 years ago now, where we actually, in one of the housing authority facilities, we did rainwater harvesting. We basically took parking lot islands, buried cisterns in there, and that's what's used for the irrigation system for that facility. So stormwater management benefit, water use reduction. Yes.
Mark, you mentioned that this was a grant project. What type of grant would you use in a situation like that?
So the one, I'm not sure, I can't remember on this one specifically, Dean. The one for the housing authority was actually a HUD grant. It had a unique aspect for improving the environment around the housing authority project, and so it was a HUD funded grant that we had to use that we used for that one. So there's a variety out there. I know, the watershed planning 319. So if for those that aren't familiar, section 319 of the Clean Water Act is basically if you have a section 319 approved watershed plan, which Kish have, is it 319? Yes. Okay.
Somebody in the room know they have one. Raise their hand. Okay, City of DeKalb,
Yep.
City of Sycamore, now Kirkland, Kingston, Genoa, all of you have approved watershed-based plans
Yep.
that are eligible for 319.
Funding. Okay, that's why, and I knew EPA was trying to cover the state. I knew there was one or two watersheds that didn't, so thanks, Dean, for that. So, so most of the state of Illinois and your whole area, it sounds like, is covered with a 319 approved watershed-based plan. So basically, if you have that plan and you come up with a project like this that is identified or towards the aim of that plan, like what is listed in that plan, improving water quality. There should clarify, water quality, Clean Water Act is just that, Clean Water Act. So it's focused on the water quality side of things, but you can, as I'm showing here, get double benefit, the quantity and the water quality aspect. So if you went in with a grant for this, you would want to focus on the water quality. You'd want to focus on the aspects identified as the concerns in the watershed plan, but then you could get a project like this potentially funded. So any questions on that? All right. So I'm not going to get in the weeds because I know everybody's not as excited about sizing stuff as some of us in the room. But basically just kind of show some considerations that go into sizing some of these practices. Bioretention cell rain garden is shallow planted basin that collects and treats stormwater runoff using soils and plants, and sometimes with an underdrain. I've think through my years of experience of, under drain. So as to your point earlier, these are opportunities to recharge, and try to get down. I'd say, some of I typically default and recommend my team to think of an under drain first. I actually had to hand dig an under drain into a site once. Was not fun, but because it was highly compacted urban soils underneath it, and it was ponding too much, the vegetation was dying. So we ended up putting an under drain in. You can do the under drain in a way like it's shown here, where you still promote that infiltration for a portion of it, but then if you get an extreme event, you still have an opportunity to get rid of the water so you don't kill off all your vegetation or end up with a muddy pit. I mean, that's one thing with green infrastructure I'm a big proponent of, is make it look pretty, make it look good. Don't let it become that muddy pit. I did some projects down in Will County where there was some construction issues like compaction during construction, but the look didn't quite go right. We had codes and covenants and restrictions on this subdivision to protect those in perpetuity. They are all mowed turf grass right now, and it's somewhat disappointing. So under drains, make sure that you can keep the design appeal, maintenance requirements, using natives. And then you do have. If you have water table issues or bedrock, I have had a site with challenges with the bedrock too, so we weren't able to do that as well. But those are some of the key there. Permeable pavers, if you aren't aware, permeable pavers, that's where the best demonstration is pouring that bucket I talked earlier about. I think I've seen, demonstrations with skid steer buckets full of water where they'll just dump it and then you can see how fast it infiltrates. But basically using an underlying gravel layer to try to infiltrate. Again, probably an under drain is recommended for quite a few of these. Using a mixture, we have done sites where the drive lanes are paved like normal, where the snow plows are going to be, and then the parking lanes or parking stalls are actually the permeable pavers. So I have another site with a client in northern Michigan where they just did probably the underutilized portion of their store parking lot. They had to have that parking lot to meet the current code requirements for how many parking spots they needed, but they know they don't use it all. They wanted to do green infrastructure, so they put green infrastructure over in that part. In the winter, they actually shut that part off because they don't want to be putting salt in that, because the salt's going to go right through and into the river that's right next door. So there are different ways to get creative to use the permeable pavers. And obviously drawdown time is important so that you're not flooding the street or the parking area, and just some general rule of thumbs, but maintenance is required, the sweeping, vacuuming to prevent that surface from clogging. So these are detention, retention. What we're most familiar with here, I would say, is just having the large detention basins. Which we have detention versus retention. The way I typically describe it is, detention, you detain somebody. You are just holding back the water, and then you're going to let it go at a slower pace. Retention, you're retaining them, you're keeping them. And so, but that then promote infiltration or evaporation, usually with an overflow, for an emergency overflow. But basically determining the required storage volume, the basin dimensions, including pre-treatment at the basin inlets, for example, a forebay. We talked earlier about maintenance. Typically, a forebay is a ponding area at the inlets to the detention basin that you can kind of create a berm or a pool area where that's your maintenance location. All the heavier sands and particles come in there. They drop out in that location. And instead of having to dredge the whole pond, you're cleaning out in that location, as opposed to cleaning out the entire pond, which is very expensive. The soils that are in these ponds usually have metals, PAHs, a lot of pollutants. So when you're trying to manage that soil, it can be very expensive. You don't want to have to deal with more sediment than you need to. So sediment forebays, huge fan of those. I'm also a big fan of, or not a big fan of concrete raceways through basins. If you think back through those, basically these are concrete channels from the inlet to the outlet. If you think about that first flush phenomenon that we talked about earlier, Well, you're just giving it a racetrack from into the pond to out of the pond at the beginning of the storm to not have any water quality benefit. So some of the watershed plans I've worked on, that was one of our biggest recommendations. For example, in the Hickory Creek watershed down in Will County, was any of the ponds with concrete raceways, let's do something different. You can still have that channel, but you could do a naturalized channel through it with check dams, things like that. You can still have that low flow channel, but let's not give a pollutant racetrack through the pond. So, and then gentle side slopes for safety and maintenance as well as you enter. Some ordinances I've seen that up to actual 10-to-1 wetland shelf, and then you can plant wetland vegetation around the edge.
Mark, I was gonna say,
Yeah.
another good retrofit
Yeah.
to removing that concrete channel from
Yeah.
the inlet to the outlet is a level spreader, which just turns that horizontal.
Yeah.
And not only does it not concentrate the flow, but it purposely
Right.
levels it out and spreads it out and uses the whole pond for your treatment.
Yep.
Instead of just one little area.
Exactly.
You had a slide that said pollutant removal and green infrastructure can vary between 30 and 60% pollutant removal.
Oh, that was runoff reduction. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. I was gonna mention that we have at the tollway we use a lot of road salt.
Yeah.
It's our number one pollutant we're concerned with, but also heavy metals from roadway runoff from our like brake dust and
Okay.
so lead, chromium, zinc. We've been able to show for 12 years of sampling that we can remove chlorides at least out of the stormwater by building that bioswale with 30-inch of sand in the underdrain.
Okay.
And the roadway metals you can reduce in the stormwater by 65%.
That's awesome.
Removal just by having it drain to a bioswale first before.
That's great. Yes, and the chloride's not easy to deal with, and so that's good.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
that BMP database
Yeah.
that your company worked on, and that's where you can go look that up.
Right.
John, I was going to give you the link actually because you can type in any treatment and it'll give you the percent removal of each of the foods that
Right.
you address.
Now we did.
Sales,
It does look like we nerded out a little bit in the sense that we do box whisker plots on there to demonstrate a BMP effectiveness. But part of the reason we do that, and you can refresh yourself from your high school statistics what box whisker plots are. But one thing I will make when you look at it, it does look a little bit complicated when you look at the results. But the reason we do that is we're truly trying to evaluate the effectiveness of what comes in and what goes out. And statistically, is that different as opposed to just looking at pure percentages of reduction, because that's a function of how big your pile of dirt is. And so we're really looking at that statistical. So that's one, if Kelsey, suggesting you look at it. I'm just giving my disclaimer of sometimes people say it's overly complicated, but it's a true statistically evaluated approach of like, is this BMP having the effectiveness that we're hoping it does? So I know I'm getting a little short on time, so I'm good. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit, move into cascading flooding impacts. So when we have the compound flooding and the urban resilience that we're talking about, how do we take account for some of these extreme events and the new data that we're getting of high intensity storms. So urban areas are especially vulnerable to compound flooding due to that impervious area and the complex infrastructure. We actually, some of the urban areas that we've worked on, typically, logically, everybody would say, small pipe goes to big pipe, goes to bigger pipe, goes to bigger pipe. Some of the urban areas we've worked on that are old, it goes the other way. And so, that's not an easy fix, right? And I worked on one site that there was, it was water main, and they weren't sure what it was, but it was cored out wood as a drainage system. And so, we have some very complex infrastructure issues in these urban areas. But where I'm going with that, so from a flooding perspective, we have that critical infrastructure. We have the flooding. We have the critical infrastructure damage that can occur from the flooding. We get into public health and utility failures, from the basement backups that we talked about to just simple, can I get my family out on the infrastructure? Can I get to the ATM? Can I get to the store? Power failures. This is all the result of flooding. And then, of course, we have the economic impacts and the transportation disruption. So I know we talk a lot about the urban flooding and flooding when it occurs. I think, we see ordinances and flood mitigation, like get excited about those in the first year. I heard a long time ago, being from Kane County, 96 flood, right? If you want to get ordinance in place, do it the first year after flooding, but that's not what hopefully we can plan for it. That's reactionary mindset. Can we plan for it? Can we be proactive to try to minimize the flooding? I will tell you, retrofitting is very expensive. Doing it during the initial site development, much more cost effective. A lot of the ordinances I've worked on, not to go off on a tangent, but retrofitting existing urban areas is always, what are we going to do with that? And how do you, because usually those areas we're trying to promote redevelopment, things like that. How do you reduce that burden on a developer coming in and saying, oh yeah, by the way, you need to do a bunch of stormwater management. I know you don't have the land to do it. So how do we, figure out creative ways through incentive programs or other ways to deal with those problems that were already created and that we're trying to mitigate. So it just takes a lot of thinking. It's not a simple solution. And that's why planning is important. Oops, trigger happy here. Sorry. So just getting into some of the resilience, planning that we're talking about is just, looking at those, doing some mapping, understanding the floodplains, and, figuring out if your zoning and all that align. We do a lot of work in our watershed plans where we look at all the different ordinances together, floodplain ordinances, landscaping ordinances, all those. How do we really take a look at that holistic, integrated approach of land use planning so we don't have one ordinance fighting with the other ordinance? And the landscaping one's the one we always see on green infrastructure is, yes, we can do that, but the landscaping ordinance says you can't have that type of vegetation, or vice versa, or that's going to be considered a weed and it needs to be mowed down if it's longer than 6 inches. So you really need to take that holistic approach. Then we talked about updating, the design standards to be, more climate informed, incorporating and promoting the distributed green infrastructure, and then adaptive management, trying to understand what is the true drivers of our risk, and with the real-time data and streams, things like that as well. And then having emergency coordination protocols, across sector response plans and backup plans for critical services. So that's getting more, into that upper part of that diagram I just showed, but making sure we understand flooding as a driver and how are we going to respond to it, because we're not going to be able to plan our way out of flooding. So just to go a little bit more with this adaptive management approach, and looking at it. So basically, I'm not going to nerd out here too much, but basically what we're showing here is, so Bulletin 75, this is a precipitation frequency study for Illinois. So really when we're doing design, of BMPs, we're looking at this for information on how do we feed it into our design. And then, in 2020, that was 2020. In 2025, Illinois State Water Survey also came out with projected precipitation frequency. So looking forward, like we were talking about, using that data, probabilistic look. So I just do this as a point. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we all go rewrite ordinances and say, everything has to be the, actually, the Bulletin 76 is, there's some caveats on it of using it for design storms, so but it just gives us an idea. We used it actually to look at the total runoff based on the percent of impervious for a 10-year, 2-hour event for a 1 acre area. The bottom line here is just based on the amount of runoff for the current design standard. But if you start looking at some of the projected for 2050, 2075, 2021, 2100. Yeah, I can't even see. None of us are going to be here for that. But anyways, but it just shows you, if you do start using that data to look out more, the runoff volume, it increases quite a bit. This is for sizing a stormwater management feature with allowable release rate of 2.2 cubic feet for a 100-year, 24-hour storm. This just shows you the total target storage that you would need based on those different projections. So this goes exactly to your point of, can we use that data to be more informed about not where have we been, but where could we go and how do we design towards that? And so, this is from CMAP, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. We must be resilient and prepare for future change, both known and unknown. So it doesn't mean that, your ordinances have to be completely clairvoyant and predict what's going to happen, but have the ability to be updated as we move forward. So,
Bulletin 75 is the current.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it looked like a 30%
right.
difference in the amount of water
Right.
volume for a future 100-year storm than what the current
Yeah.
100-year storm. So all of our pipes and ponds would be 30% undersized.
Potentially, yeah. And that's where I think there's some caveats of, and I was talking to my colleague right before I came in about, is anybody, because the one previous, the Bulletin 75, one of our employees worked on that when he was at the state water survey. He didn't work on the second one, but you don't use the projected for design, but the idea is we need to start thinking about this because it could have a dramatic effect. Are we going to design out to 2100 right now? No. But can we have our ordinances and guidance documents set up so that they're malleable enough to keep up with if this is the way the next 30 years worth of data tells us we're going to go, then we can make those changes as we go.
I think that's also, our next January date will have the intelligence.
Yes.
So that will be the full conversation.
Yeah. That's why I told Peggy I was going to do some foreshadowing, and she didn't even know that to the next presentation.
Yeah, so according to the Illinois State Water Survey, that's that bulletin.
Yeah.
They're essentially saying the new 100-year storm volume is 30% greater than what the last 50.
Yeah, so that was it's just gonna, so that was the first graph was the 10-year storm, but right here. The bulletin 75 and 76. So they're yours.
John, so for the city of DeKalb, for example, you guys use bulletin 75 or bulletin
70. So,
70. So that's been in place for the last 20, 30 years?
76.
2014. Okay, so at least till then.
Yeah.
And that the 100-year storm that a designer in DeKalb, for example, today would use is the old 100-year storm event, essentially. And so it'll be interesting to see what the Illinois State Water Survey projects, but it takes each individual community or regulatory authority to adopt the new recommendation. So they're doing the number crunching, but we would have to make the decision changes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, that's not easy, right? Yeah, to change it overnight. Yes, exactly.
Somebody comes in, they're proactive and says, hey, we're willing to design bullets in 75 and create more capacity than the storage system. Right.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's great. Okay. All right. So again, just kind of summing up things, just, obviously, there's expanded research, how could we figure out some ways to bridge what Kelsey and John were just talking about is, how do you take some of this projected information and incorporate it in a more dynamic ordinance writing and things like that. So it's not a huge task. Again, I'm on my village plan commission. I know when we're going to do new ordinances, it takes 5-6 meetings to get through just the plan commission, let alone through the board. And so it's not easy to change ordinances. But how could we look at some of this projected information? How could we write those documents that they're a little bit more dynamic in a way that, it is also not too loosey-goosey, for lack of better words. And then obviously promoting, community engagement, involving stakeholders in that planning, implementing, a lot of, again, seeing some of the development pressure you're under. I'm sure everybody has opinions about data centers. I hosted an internal conference a couple weeks ago, and we, had I offered the challenge, how many times we're going to say data centers over the next 2 days? It was 56. Somebody kept track. But, getting people involved in that planning, the implementation, I think I'm a very big proponent of community engagement so that we can have the well-rounded considerations of the community and not just the person trying to build something. So basically, control what you can by making these land use decisions, keeping flooding in the front of your mind. the modern flood management requires planning, updated storms, design storms and green infrastructure, considering compound flooding, increased extreme events, demand integrated adaptive solutions. So with that, I invite any questions or discussions. Yes, sir.
So, Mark, you're a consultant.
Yes.
So, this is an odd way to look at it. So you don't do ambulance chasing, you don't go and say to the community and say, you need to do this. People come to you.
Yes.
So you don't have any, there's no systems that out there that people are looking at this and actually going to community saying, you need to look at this. That's what we're
Yeah, I would say we do that a lot through the watershed planning work, or through, some of this that I presented here was actually through a resiliency project that we did do for CMAP that included a lot of outreach. The project I mentioned in the city of Chicago for MWRD that we did a couple of years ago, that was a lot of outreach to the communities. And it's not just outreach, it's solicitation of what will work. What do you want to see? So, we had in the city of Chicago, we navigated the aldermatic environment. We had aldermen, hold the meeting or request the meetings for us. It's a challenge because the best example I give out of that Chicago one was the alderman would call a meeting to talk about flooding right after a flood. But we ended up talking about crime and safety because everybody got in the room. And the alderman called the meeting. The residents had the alderman attention. So my point in all that is, yes, we do that as consultants. We work for communities and we do it through the watershed planning or the large planning work, but it is really hard to get flooding to the top of the attention, even right after the flood. So that's why the planning for it and trying to incorporate it into the designs and incorporate it into infrastructure rehab projects. We have done some work in that regard of, if we're going to do a project that involves, replacing sewers or something like that, here's what else we're going to incorporate so incremental improvements. So that's the other way to do it, because just getting it through some more community push is not going to happen.
The February workshop here, we'll talk about, Cecily Kuhn from Beck will be here to say, part of a watershed plan is to inventory how many detention basins a community has. Something like the agency, roadway agency I work for, we would hire a geosynthetic works company to calculate how many acres of detention basin do I have in my right of way, and if I dug them all 3 foot deeper, could I get that 30% extra storage? And they would assess each one and say, in some areas the groundwater is too high. Digging down will give you no more storage. In some cases, he'll say, your outlet could just be retrofitted to a smart device to throw water in a small storm. So in a larger storm, it could be more available for you. So they do community sub-watershed assessments too. And that's a good way to even know how far away you are from a design to a new storm.
Most importantly, y'all just heard verbal contract. Kelsey's going to hire me, right? So, all right. Yes, Nick.
So you mentioned Minnesota being a good example of land use management as far as solar recycling goes, but I'm curious, like based on your experience or just knowledge in doing this kind of work, what are some other municipalities or states even that have really robust and forward-thinking strategies to either do green infrastructure or flood mitigation?
Yeah, so I would say Chicagoland area is right up there from a detention perspective. We've been, John, you probably, 0.15 CFS per acre for how many years, right? That all came out of CMAP. That was our design standard from Dennis Strayer, who works with Geosynthetic now, but was at NIPSI, predecessor to CMAP. Tom Price. That was the early 90s that I think we started doing the detention. The water quality has been implemented, in DePage and others for 20 years now. So we're pretty progressive in those regards. Prince George's County, Maryland, that's where LID that I referred to kind of came out of, low impact development. And that's where a lot of these green infrastructure. North Carolina with Bill Hunt out of NC State, he's done a lot in North Carolina as well. So I think there's quite a few, hot spots around the country, but there's I think about it when like some of my national developer clients that I work with, or even regional, the stormwater and green infrastructure are just part of their normal site. Not the green infrastructure so much, but the stormwater detention at a minimum is just part of their normal site plan. That's the expectation as they go into communities.
Are there any particular factors as far as like the political landscape that is moving certain places in that direction versus others?
Um, Not necessarily, other than the flooding, is a big issue. Water quality, of course, the challenge I've had with the water quality side, and, I think Melissa maybe will present this. Like when I did the Hickory Creek watershed plan down in Will County, people didn't even know Hickory Creek was back there. So we're telling them that we're trying to protect Hickory Creek. I actually went, fly fishing on Hickory Creek, like during the project, loved it, caught some nice, fish on it. Um, and I'm like, these people have this in their backyard and they don't even know it's there. And so I think the education component of, you know, I mean, other than Illinois is not a water facing state as opposed to like I said, Arkansas, it's their drinking water. I grew up in Michigan. It's the lakes, right? It's you got to find that way to connect people to the resource you're protecting. I grew up, my dad's a logger. I tried to explain to my dad, the regulators were bad to my dad, and environment stuff. But I'm like, Dad, you're a fisherman. You love, fishing. That's what I'm trying to protect. And not trying to, so I think you just have to tie it to what people are interested in. So.
Step in and Mark's not going anywhere.
Nope.
He's got the floor.
Yeah.